Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I am so excited to have you and to host you, and an extra thank you for making the time to be on one more Zoom. But this is one of the most important conversations of our era. You know, as you had read, COVID threatens to make today's kids and young adults a lost generation due to the impact of remote learning, recession, lack of jobs and support systems, and more. How do we turn the lost generation into the generation forward? A cohort of young people with the tech skills to change the world and their own destinies. So that is sort of level setting on what we'll cover today. The richness of the stories and the research and the work that's being done will just be the highlight of your week for sure. A couple of housekeeping points. If you're not automatically muted by our production team, please mute your audio. There will be a Q&A at the end. We'll have 10 minutes for that. There is a lot to cover, and we will definitely leave you wanting more. I call this time forced innovation. There was a lot of talk about upskilling and reskilling and the future of work that were seemingly buzzwords pre-COVID. But as I had said earlier, this is one of the most important conversations, initiatives, really of our era. Upskilling and reskilling, the future of work, those words really epitomize inclusion. We have with us today two of the most incredible thought and action leaders that will talk about this. And with that, I would like to read quick bios of Rose and Byron. And then we're going to get into opening remarks, some questions, and then a Q&A from all of you. Rose Kirk is the Chief Corporate Social Responsibility Officer and Marketing Executive for Verizon. She is a friend. She is a client of Culture Shift Labs. We are proud to have a relationship over several years. She oversees the corporation's corporate social responsibility portfolio and manages the programmatic build and investment strategy for Verizon's social impact assets. An important woman in our work. Additionally, she's accountable for the marketing and talent development portfolio for Verizon's CSR, Ad Fellows, and Marketing Academy initiatives. She is an award-winning journalist and marketer and executive producer of the documentary, who you may have all seen. If not, please watch it, Without a Net, The Digital Divide in America. She's a member of the Executive Leadership Council and the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Leadership Council as well, and serves on the Women's Leadership Board of the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard School, as well as the Board of Directors. She just got voted onto Casella Waste Systems as a board member, and the World Childhood Foundation. She holds former positions as the chair of the board, executive committee chair, and governance committee member of Dress for Success, as well as strategic planning chair and finance committee member for Gill St. Bernard School. She is putting in the work. She's also a mom and a wife, and so she is doing it all, and doing it all well, I might add. Byron Auguste was inspired by a diverse set of experiences to conceive and co-found Opportunity at Work in 2015. He knows so many people who found themselves stuck, unable to contribute to their full talents or be rewarded for them. He's seen heroic nonprofit efforts strive to achieve inclusion and fall short, we all know stories about that, of scale, but knows the massive and inclusive economic benefits of rewiring the labor market so work and learning can lead to better earning. You could tweet that. Before co-founding Opportunity at Work, Byron served for 2 years in the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. Until 2013, Byron was a senior partner in McKinsey & Company, and prior to McKinsey, was an economist, at LMC International, Oxford University, and the African Development Bank. Until his appointment at the White House, Byron was active in a number of nonprofit organizations, serving as a board of trustee of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and Yale University. He's an elected member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Pacific Council on International Policy. He serves as a board member of Hope Street Group, the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and also Opportunity at Work. You can find Rose and Byron on Twitter, and please help me welcome two incredible leaders that we will have 40 minutes of a teachable moment. So with that, I would love to pass it on to Rose for a quick opening statement, then on to Byron, and I will start asking some questions.
Great. So good morning, everyone. Andrea, thank you for that introduction. Byron, it is such a pleasure to engage in this conversation with you today. And I'm going to keep my opening remarks short because I want us to get right into the conversation for this audience. I mean, look, Verizon has made this commitment that we are going to upskill and reskill 500,000 individuals by 2030. And as we look at the profile of who those individuals are, they are individuals who might be considered traditionally, undereducated, underemployed. But the reason that's important is because, at Verizon, most of our jobs don't actually require a degree. Now, some of them do, but most of them don't. And the benefit of that is when you look across at our executive levels, some of the highest levels in this company, we have people who will proudly tell you they are running P&L, they are running huge functions, and they don't have a college degree. What they do have, though, are the skill sets that it takes to be successful. They know how to problem solve. They are collaborative. They are ongoing learners. They manage people well. Isn't that what we need to be doing more of in this society, is giving opportunity to people who have these types of skills and can invest in this kind of training and on-the-job learning? Because what you're going to find is that at every level of management, some of these skills are actually the same. And the fundamental issue is that corporations have a huge opportunity to lean in and start addressing some of these big issues. Our own research is showing us that this younger generation, people between the ages of 18 and 34, are actually trusting big business to be a part of this solution. So we've got to lean in. We got to figure that out across dimensions of accessibility, mobility, prosperity. How do we lean in and how do we help people be successful when they may not have that 4-year degree? Because I will tell you, I've never interviewed a person and spent time talking about their college degree. What I have done is interviewed them and spent time talking about their skills, their capabilities, how they're going to actually, do these roles. So this pandemic is our moment in time to change our narrative and change our approach and create an environment where there is equal opportunity for all. So I'll leave it at that, let Byron hop in, and I can't wait to get into the questions with everyone.
Thank you, Rose. And I'm really inspired by what Rose just said. And actually, when Rose and Andrea asked me to join this conversation, I accepted immediately because I really think we are at a moment, and I think we can all see we're at a moment of genuine danger for our country, and that there's a risk to an entire generation for their economic mobility, their potential. And I spend a lot of time on economic policymaking, and there are very important issues of, fiscal policy and the COVID rescue and small businesses and the monetary policy. All of those are very important. However, what Rose just said, the mindset that Rose just talked about, and the absence of that mindset, the creeping of this idea that the potential of people is just in their degrees, what you can read on a resume, as opposed to what they can actually do, is actually, I think, almost as damaging as any set of government policies we've had. And I think the direction Rose is pointing to is going to be absolutely critical to solving it. So economist Peter Atwood described what's happening right now as a K-shaped recovery. I don't know if you've heard that term. When I first heard it, it took me a second to realize what he meant. So the economists talk about a V-shaped recovery. It's like a decline and a quick rebound, or a U-shaped recovery. That's a bit slower, right? If you're very pessimistic, an L-shaped, it's flat. But a K-shaped recovery, which is a new term, is one where some set of the people recover like this right away, and others just keep falling. And if you actually look at the numbers right now, we're in a K-shaped recovery. There's enormous parts, I imagine most people on this call, whose financial situation has rebounded pretty well, and there are a lot of people that are being left behind. So if we want a different recovery, we have to act differently, and we have to act now. We need to think about much bigger changes in trajectory, and not just government has to think about it, but companies have to think about it too. And I think what Rose just laid out and the commitments Verizon is making is a kind of an illustration of the kind of scale that we need. Because remember, before COVID-19 hit, we were already in this generational shift, and not in a good way. If you were 30 years old in 1970, you had a 91% chance as an American to be earning more than your parents did before you in real terms. By the time we got to 2010, if you were 30 years old, you had a 50-50 chance, a coin flip, to have higher earnings. And you can imagine when we see the 2020 data, that's not going to be better. And the hardest hit was, yes, African Americans, yes, Latinx, but in particular, Americans who don't have bachelor's degrees. And part of why that is, people want to talk about a skills gap, and we all need new skills all the time, but we have to recognize that the phenomenon that has happened, particularly after the last recession, is that companies have massively increased the quote unquote educational requirements, degree requirements. Now, 3/4 of administrative assistant job postings require a bachelor's degree to be considered, even though only 1/3 of administrative assistants have bachelor's degrees. So they're doing, and you know, we can be doing a good job. So we have a situation now where that's a lot of what's driving this K-shaped recovery. And we're at a moment again where because the labor market's not as tight, we have a risk that companies are going to just keep saying, well, you know, it's too hard a job to figure out who can really do the job. So we're just going to go by degrees. We're just going to plug that into our applicant tracking system and then set it on autopilot. But that sort of very modest convenience is actually a catastrophe for tens of millions of Americans. So let me be clear. When you put a bachelor's degree requirement on a job, be aware that you are immediately excluding over 3/4 of African Americans, over 80% of Latinx, and by the way, over 80% of rural Americans of all races. So you better be darn sure that you actually need it. And the fact of the matter is, the kind of qualities that Rose just talked about, that's what we're actually looking for. So Opportunity at Work's role in this is really to help companies connect to alternative pathways and really focus on 70 million Americans who have skills for these jobs, but they're skilled through alternative routes. We call them stars. And so that's part of what I want to bring to the debate, because ultimately work is solving problems. And if you look around you, you'll see we got a lot of problems. So there's a lot of work to do. And young people are problem solvers. Stars are problem solvers. And they are showing up every day to try to work, try to contribute. And we need to have our institutions show up for them. And that's what I think this conversation needs to be about.
Thank you both, Rose and Byron. Before I jump into the questions, I just want to give a quick shout out. We have an incredible group of people on the phone, from venture investors to CEOs of large and impactful nonprofits. We have Tawana Franklin on the phone, and Danny Rojas, and folks from EY and Imaginable Futures and LinkedIn, and David Carey from Hearst. I mean, it is an incredible group of people that are really leaning into this moment and this conversation. So we will be able to spread this message and your insight far and wide. So with that, I'm going to jump into the question. We have 3 questions for Rose and 3 questions for Byron. We will ask them, we'll do sort of a back and forth, and then we'll open it up to questions. So please save your questions until the end so I don't miss any. Please keep introducing yourselves in the chat so everybody can connect as what we're known for. First question, Rose. We've all seen the pandemic has exposed how many of America's systems designed to protect our most vulnerable populations are broken. Both of you covered that. What is the responsibility of large enterprises like Verizon to fix that?
Yeah, so let me just respond by almost sort of going back to some of the things that you heard Byron say, because I think he laid out the very comprehensive case for why we have to think differently. But there are a couple of components that I want to bridge off of. And you talk about this K economy. I was so glad to hear you go back to the fact that that sort of slant in that K are the people who aren't going to recover. And I would argue with you and the economists that they never had a recovery to begin with. Like, what are they recovering to? Because recovery assumes that there was a space where they were already doing well. So as we think about our space within Verizon, we are dealing with those individuals who aren't even yet on the path to recovery. We are trying to get them into the opportunity. And so at Verizon, to answer your question, I think it's fundamentally, how do we think about that across all the ecosystem of impact? I shared early on sort of our narrative of how we hire and what we're looking for. And listen, we're a very successful global company. And so clearly we figured out that you can bring in the skill sets, the talent at different levels and create an environment where people can thrive and grow their careers and be successful. I mean, yes, are there jobs where we're absolutely going to say we need that college degree, because what a college degree is supposed to do is prepare you with training and skills and opportunity for a future of success. But likewise, we're going to look at those individuals where we are understanding that they've determined that because they've gotten certifications or they have had job experiences already, and they're bringing sort of the type of skill sets that we need to help us be successful as a company. So that agility is really important. That's one thing that large enterprises have to do. The other way, though, that we're thinking about this ecosystem is with our program of upskilling and reskilling, and really identifying those vulnerable population, members of vulnerable populations that Byron just sort of spoke to, who, if we don't think about the role of our own technology like 5G and what types of jobs it is going to disrupt, then we are doing ourselves a disservice. And so we are concerned about and looking at some of those entry-level frontline jobs that people of color are often doing. And as 5G comes into play, it is going to create a whole new way that technology and the robots do it for us, and people are going to lose their jobs. So our upskilling and reskilling is really all about how do we lean into that early on, not only upskill and reskill, but bring in partners into that equation, because our end result, our goal for ourselves, Andrea, is that 80% of those people that we upskill and reskill have a job on the end of it. So Right. It's not just the nice to do of now you have a new skill, but now we want you to get a job. And so a part of the opportunity for this audience is how you become a partner in some of that work, placing them not only at Verizon, but at other companies. The third thing is about how we intervene early on in the education system to make sure with some of the work that we do in education with our Verizon Innovative Learning School programs, with 5G labs that we're putting inside of schools, work that we're doing with small businesses to make them successful so they can employ individuals and give them a path to economic opportunity, is investing really heavily in those systems by building programs, building partnerships, that is educating people on technology and problem solving and developing these very skills that Byron is talking about that people are going to need to be successful. Yeah. So if you look at what we're doing, it's that whole equation of bringing all of that to the table.
Right. Right. And I know in people listening, you know, their minds is, how do we do that? What is the first step? So we'll put a pin in that, because I want everybody on the phone to walk away with some very concrete things that you say, as a result of taking my time to be on this call, this Zoom in this room, you know, what can I go to move the needle forward? Thank you for that, Rose. I think that was, you know, really a big picture, you know, way to think about all of the parts. There's a lot to do here, but we will move this forward every day. This is an important time. Byron, question for you, which you may have answered in your opening remarks. And if you did, I will just let you riff off of what Rose said or what you want to sort of share at this moment. The question was, after the last recession, many U.S. employers started screening out job candidates who lacked a four-year degree, even for jobs that never required them before. Why does this matter? And are we about to see that happen again? I don't know if you really answered that, but feel free to, you know, elaborate.
Well, I'll give you a personal story of why it matters, and then I'll give you kind of the step back why it matters for, you know, your company or the economy. So in 1970, my own father was a shipping clerk in a factory in Detroit. He'd never worked in an office. He'd gone to college for a year, didn't really find much in it. He dropped out after a year. He didn't know what he was, you know, he wasn't going anywhere. Small family-owned business. He had a job. It was fine, but he wasn't going anywhere. He saw an ad in the newspaper, which is something they had back then, that was for Learn COBOL, COBOL. It's the IBM programming language for the mainframes. And at the time, the demand for it was just exploding. It said, learn COBOL and print your own ticket, to Rose's point that you could get a job at the end. And he had never been in an office. He'd never worked in technology, but he knew he needed to do something. So my mom had a job. He actually quit his job. He studied for 6 months, still had his certificate, Controlled Data Corp. He learned COBOL, got a job shadow at Detroit Edison, got an entry-level job. That was the trajectory shift of our family into the American middle class. Now think about it. That was 70, 71. I'm going to presume there was more racial discrimination facing my father as a black man in the United States at that time. But in fact, there was less discrimination, less bias against him because he didn't have a bachelor's degree. Like that, the person, someone taking that trajectory would have a much, much harder time today, to make it into the American middle class. And no one could tell by looking at my father's resume that he would be a great COBOL programmer. To know that, you had to see what he could do, what he could learn, how fast. You had to take him seriously as a person, right? Not just as a resume, and not just as a machine readable resume. So scroll forward right now. Companies are experiencing these skills gaps. I mean, the qualities that Rose is talking about, it's not a favor for a company to hire someone like that. That is how companies succeed, right? But you're screening, so 70% of new job postings say a bachelor's degree is required, but only 40% of Americans have a bachelor's degree. 30% of the workforce is a big gap. That's tens of millions of people. That math doesn't work. So that explains by itself the skills gap. If you are screening people out, right, before you evaluate their skills, well, then you're sure as heck going to have a skills gap. And if you want to know the practical implication of that, the practical implication is three things in my view. Number one, don't put a bachelor's degree requirement on a job unless you have a very good reason. If someone needs a medical degree to do surgery, they might need a structural engineering degree to build a bridge. Right. But if you just a general sales job, marketing job, et cetera, saying that job has to have a bachelor's degree, that has a lot of cost and maybe less benefit than you think. Number two, we know now from our data, there's 70 million stars as people who are skilled through alternative routes. 30 million of them, by the way, in our research, they have the skills for jobs that pay at least 50% more. And we can see the pattern of going through gateway jobs that they can move up. So figure out as a company where you're going to find the stars, right, to complement your other sources of talent. Do it systematically. It's part of your business. And then number three, look at the stars in your own company. Some of the best places to look for talent are in gateway jobs, like in call centers and help desks, like in admin assistant roles and so forth. So keep those jobs open to stars. Don't make those degree requirement jobs, but also look to promote and to develop the best performers, because that is a tremendous asset for your company. And there's many, many companies that are now overlooking that talent.
Right. And then let me jump in on that, because I think the other part is get rid of that elitism culture, right? Because while you can take those very specific steps that Byron just talked about, but then you drop people into an environment where you have such elitism around those degrees, and you limit those people's trajectory for opportunities to advance, and you have these forums where unintentionally you're talking about these issues of degrees, then you are not going to be successful even when you bring them in. And so you've got to really think deeply about that culture that you're creating. And then you've got to think about, where are you going to find the talent? If most companies are only recruiting on college campuses, then by default, you're only bringing in people with college degrees. And so a part of what you got to think about is, where are the forums and where are the places that we are out having these conversations on recruiting, and being very deliberate in that. So you have to look at that whole ecosystem of it and figure out, where do we need to disrupt it, because it's not aligned with the ultimate goal. That, Andrea, is very tangible in terms of specifics that have to be done.
Yep. Yeah. And I just for housekeeping, so we have about 8 more minutes with you and Byron Rose, and then we open it up to questions. So hopefully you'll be able to cover some of the other questions that we have here if we don't have time, and we'll get through everything. One of my favorite stories is, Rose, I had sent you the links for Linda Resnick, who was one of the co-founders of the wonderful company, and how she adopted an entire city and created economic, financial, educational inclusion because they have a manufacturing company. And so how do you think about diverse talent? How do you think about talent that you can't, may not see very readily? And so there's a lot of interesting stories there that we have to aggregate all of this somehow so that people have these case studies and best practices to follow and improve on. So much goodness here. Rose, the second question for you, and again, you may have answered some of this already. As a technology company, how has Verizon cared for individuals losing their jobs and are being replaced by automation and AI and other advanced technologies? The second part of that, if you answered the first part or want to put your own spin on this, how does 5G figure into the solution?
Yeah, I did talk about that a little bit. Let me go a little bit deeper. The benefit of 5G, and you know that I believe in the benefit of 5G, is going to be how it's going to change the way that we think about solving problems and what's the ecosystem of businesses that are going to be created on the end of that, right? So the first thing that we are doing is making sure that we are building this 5G intelligent workforce inside of our existing education schools, where it's mandatory that everyone has to go through K through 12, right? So we're putting 5G in schools, working with teachers, with students, with administrators to make sure that we're cultivating this 5G intelligent workforce and teaching them how to problem solve, how to collaborate, how to create all these skills that are going to be necessary in the economy, necessary to get a job. Let me layer on that, though, one of the other components as we think about then what do you do with that and where do you look for talent is my hope is that a whole percentage of these young people then create small businesses as a result of having this insight. And as you are creating these small businesses, you may or may not go to college in that regard. A lot of our work is in Title I, underserved middle schools where, greater than 70% of kids qualify for free or reduced lunch. Some of them will go to college, some of them won't. But are we giving them the skills right now that can be useful? Are we giving them skills that would allow them to create small businesses? And then frankly, to connect it to the earlier point, as companies, we need to be looking to these small businesses as talent. We need to be thinking about these people who are creating, these entrepreneurial opportunities and bringing them into our companies as our own employees. A lot of the small businesses, particularly those that are created by vulnerable populations, aren't going to survive. They don't have access to capital. They don't have access to resources. But think about the profile of who just created that small business. I want you to be an employee at Verizon. So we have to think about the path that we're putting you on in middle school, the role that we're doing to teach you about the use of 5G and what that can mean for entrepreneurship, but actually creating that ongoing relationship with you over the next 5 to 6 years as you get out of high school as to how we can think about you and reinvest in you as one of our own employees, or some of the other work that we're doing is reinvesting in you to be successful as a small business. So that brings all of these pieces together with very tangible specifics of thinking about our work holistically and addressing this whole issue of the skills gap and who we are choosing to hire.
Yeah, absolutely. Rose, I know, because we've known each other for many years, I know how hard you work on behalf of something similar that Ban Jones does, nameless, faceless people that you may never meet in your lifetime. But what you're creating is a legacy, something that your children and your children's children, will benefit from. So I just want to say on behalf of everybody on the call and the entire world, thank you for the work you're doing on behalf of a powerful organization that has the ability to change the world. And same to you, Byron.
Thank you.
We have, this is important. This is important times. I am sick and tired of being sick and tired of what we're seeing in the news and how that is playing out in a lot of ways. And even this idea, I've been doing this work since 1999, this idea of I can't find any. Yeah. Not true, wrong narrative. We don't have enough time to get into that. But Byron, I have 2 questions left for you, but we don't have all the time for that. So I'm going to shoot both of them out and you choose the one or a hybrid that you want to answer. Your last answer, you talked about STARS, workers who are skilled through alternative routes is what that acronym is. How do we know STARS have skills to do higher wage work if they don't have bachelor's degree and everything that comes with that? You may have answered that. The other question I was going to ask you is, what impact will these choices have on young African-American generation forward? or others traditionally American underrepresented in the workplace. We know who that is. Professional and executive ranks. Feel free to hybrid or answer.
Sure. So the way we know, and I really think, there's the snobbery and this sense of like, oh, if a job is well paid and it has people with fancy degrees, that's a high skilled job, and that a low paid job must be a low skilled job. But it's just not true. Like, I mean, there are actually, I would say probably the majority of low paid jobs are actually very skilled jobs. They're not operating in an economic or business model where people get paid a lot. Right. So like what you see, therefore, we went across and we did this work partly with Accenture's economics team. And we have a STARS Insights Advisory panel that's chaired by Dr. Erica Groshin, the former head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and a great group of sort of economists, sociologists, et cetera. So this work is actually building a whole academic subfield in addition to the work we're doing with business. So it's very solid work. And what it essentially shows is that if you do squeeze all you can about the data of what skills are involved in different jobs, that what you see is of the 70 million stars, there's 30 million of them where they really have the skills for jobs that pay at least 50% more than the jobs they're in. And we did it by geography. So jobs that exist like in their state, this is pre-COVID, but still that's a remarkable statement of how much talent is being left on the sidelines. By the way, 5 million stars are already in high wage jobs. They've jumped the barriers. They've gotten through the brambles. And Rose, to your earlier point, the largest single profession they are is entrepreneur, CEO, sole proprietor, because they couldn't make it through the corporate thicket and they started their own business. And that's very much true. Exactly. And that's very much true of people of color, since we published that work in March, we've been digging in much deeper in the racial composition and also in what's actually happening in the market. So 2 quick points. Number one, it's true that we've tested, and the closer you are in that skills proximity we measured, the more likely you are to make the job transition, which is reassuring, right? Because you'd expect to see that in the world if that skills proximity that we talk about is true. However, people with bachelor's degrees are much more it's much more highly correlated, and people without bachelor's degrees are much more likely to be stuck. Here's the kicker. White people without bachelor's degrees, white men in particular without bachelor's degrees, are more likely to be stuck than those with bachelor's degrees, but it's a much smaller gap. Right. Whereas women, but in particular people of color, and I actually say that because it's Black people, it's Latinx, and it's Asian Americans without bachelor's degrees are much less likely to be able to follow that path that their skills would indicate. And I will say specifically with African Americans, this is very much on my mind right now, what you see is African Americans are disproportionately stuck, not at the bottom rungs of these early origin jobs, but actually at the middle, just before you can break through to the better, they're in these gateway jobs, so I said 30 million out of 70 million stars. For African-American stars, it's 62% of them are actually right on the cusp where you very clearly could move to higher paid jobs, but not moving. Yeah. So this is something that we could act on right now. There's an enormous amount of Black talent, and that's not even, obviously there's an enormous amount of Black talent with bachelor's degrees that's under tapped, but this is 6 million people that are ready for these jobs today. Yeah. And I'm not saying they don't need skills, because they definitely need contextual skills and how to work in this environment, but this is not a heavy lift for America if we got to it.
Yeah. Let me say this, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. Thank you both for all of that information. Again, I've said this a couple of times on this call, we're sick and tired of being sick and tired and there not being equal access to opportunity, from education to access to, investment dollars for venture capitalists and entrepreneurs and all of that. We have 2 important leaders here that are working towards changing that. All of us on the call we're all shaking our heads that in our lifetimes, we want to see progress. So hopefully with this insight that you're sharing, we will see progress short, mid, and long term from what we learned here today, and perhaps you'll bless us with a master class in the future where we can dig in for hours and hours and have real tangible outcomes. First question is being asked by Joel Lee. He is an advisor to a lot of the healthcare systems and CEOs and that space. Question for Rose and Byron, and we have to be thoughtful about time. We have about 10 minutes left, and that we'll be going over a little bit with that. Exploring providing corporate elementary schools where parents can bring their kids and hire proctors to help these kids with their remote learning while their moms and dads go back to work. Solve some of the childcare issues and may be the key to keeping a generation of younger children on track educationally. Quick thoughts on that?
I just want to make sure I'm clear on what is the question in that. Make sure I'm clear. What's the question that's being asked?
Companies exploring providing corporate elementary schools. It could be at the company itself. It could be maybe funding, an elementary school. But it seems like the question is having it on site at the company.
Yeah. So I don't know that I have an answer to that. I mean, I'll be very candid. Verizon isn't at the point where we're exploring sort of on-site daycare. What we do recognize, though, is that we've got to upend the entire business model as a result of what we have learned from COVID. That old adage about, let's never let a good crisis go to waste. It's shining a light on everything that we thought before has to be rethought. And what does that mean in terms of how we retain our workforce? I mean, we were very fortunate. We didn't lay off anybody during the pandemic. We haven't laid off anyone to date. But it really is a matter of then how do we continue to keep and develop that talent? And what are all the things that people need to make sure that they can be successful? And we certainly are paying attention to what's happening with folks in childcare. And then just one more second while I have the floor is to this point of focusing on how we make changes and how we get people unstuck, to the point that Byron just made. It really boils down to, are you paying attention to your data inside of any company? Are you understanding where your barriers are? Are you looking at them holistically? And are you thinking differently, even with your own training programs? At Verizon, our focus is on how do we bring certification into the training and open it up to everybody so that you can self-select your way into new jobs, into new opportunities. So just in the spirit of tangible examples, that's another way that you can start addressing this issue to deal with the stars, as Byron likes to say. So I'll leave it at that so you can get to more questions.
Great. So we have about 5 minutes left. Byron, if you have a short answer for that, which is
all I want to say is that I think we have to solve this as a society, not one company at a time. And that has at least two implications. One is we have to see childcare and education as sort of fundamental, not only to our sort of society and well-being, but as like fundamental economic infrastructure of the country. I mean, why did we open bars instead of focusing on how to open schools, right? Like, I mean, that makes no sense, but it makes sense if you think about, schools as an afterthought and childcare as an afterthought. And that is absolutely wrong. And the final thing is like the idea that broadband, that 5G broadband is a luxury good, right? That some people should have and other people shouldn't. Yeah. That's outrageous and completely unacceptable.
Yeah, absolutely outrageous. I have two questions here, one from Aaron Scruggs at LinkedIn and one from Venice Davis over at Imaginable Futures, which was a offshoot of Omidyar. Aaron leads talent acquisition for LinkedIn, and the comments about reducing elitism and changing culture resonates so much with her. Byron, coming from a 20-year career at McKinsey, which is elite, she says, how does that help you to drive your narrative about stars and have credibility when influencing leaders who focus on elite pedigrees today?
Well, I have hundreds of relationships with colleagues at McKinsey, and I have hundreds of cousins. And I can tell you that, there's a lot of things you get from, good education and all that stuff, but a lot of other things like happen in life, and people, I've never been susceptible, just given like my wider environment and family, to this idea that, that of this sort of meritocracy myth that says like all the people at the top is because of their merit, and like all the people who stumbled, there's something wrong with them. So I think that's absolutely false. What I will say is that I think the smartest people in talent acquisition, when they get around this idea of stars and this sort of talent pool, what they realize is that this is a wedge within which they can start to create a more generally kind of like culture that values actual performance and contribution and teamwork, rather than a culture that values whatever marker of elite status, however tinged that is with sexism, with, you know, racism, et cetera. Because ultimately you can't actually have a kind of a workplace that works for everybody if there's some 60% of people you have a culture it can't work for, right? Like it just brings all sorts of other pathologies. So I just think this is, any way you slice it, I don't think we're going to have a good workplace for all sorts of people if you can't you know, create a culture that welcomes stars.
Yeah, and Andrew, let me weigh in on that, because I want to weigh in from the view of a company and culture, and to the point about LinkedIn. Look, I think any corporation is an environment where you follow the leader. And so a part of the work that has to be done is not just with the HR department, right? It's not just in corporate social responsibility. It is, where are the conversations that we're having in the C-suite with the top of the house to begin to embrace and open and publicly state intent that is really going to be different. That, more than anything, is going to drive the cultural changes that has to happen inside of companies. So you gotta, you know, we have to make sure that we don't leave that out of the equation. And for all the folks, you know, on this call who are consulting with and engaging with that CEO and that C-suite, this is where you start bringing those conversations in with really fact-based data of that influence and who within companies are not degreed and are driving that kind of change. You have to be able to deal with the top of the house.
Yeah, absolutely. There's 3 questions I want to present. Hopefully, for those of you that want to stay on the line, we know we're running late. And Rose, I don't want to, you know, I want to be thoughtful of you and Byron's schedule. But one of the people on the phone, David Carey, is a very important executive, high-ranking executive with Hearst, and I see he's still on the line. And I just want to say, give him a quick shout out. He's doing incredible work over at a private company who doesn't have the public scrutiny, you know, that they have to do anything around anything, innovation, inclusion, diversity, whatever, economic, educational, or otherwise. And he is doing some incredible work. So I just want to give him a shout out and let everybody know that there are companies that are doing things privately and not so publicly. So have faith, have hope. Venice Davis.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Yay, hi, David.
I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
Value all that you're doing behind the scenes. Amazing. Is there any?
And we support this fight against degree inflation and all that it means. And I think this conversation helps elevate the awareness and concern around that. So thank you.
Excellent. David, could you make sure you just introduce yourself to everybody over the chat so everybody can know what you're doing over there?
Yep. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Venice Davis, Imaginable Futures. How do you make the business case to other large employers about investing in and hiring stars? How do you help employers change the culture around focus on skills versus degrees like Verizon has? Rose, could you give some insight into that?
Yeah, and I'm going to answer that. We may want to make that the last question, Andrea, only because I'm very respectful of people's time. I want to make sure that we are holding accountable to ourselves to that. Look, I think there's a couple of things that we did at Verizon. First of all, as we began to think about our job taxonomy, as we began to think about what are these jobs and what is a career path for someone, you began to sort of leave that conversation about and the degrees off the table. You are focusing on skills. You are focusing on what it takes. You are focusing on what the need is. And so you build that business case on, if we have this kind of talent, this is how we're going to move this business forward. And so then the question is, well, where is that talent? Where do you then go to get that talent? And yes, you can check the box on college, but you have to start being relevant to what's happening in society around, no, that talent is being built over here in a very different way, in a very different ecosystem, and are we going to bring that person on board? So you start making that business case with what does the business need to be successful, and what's that investment financially that we can make, and then how do we upskill and reskill in our own environment to make sure that we are developing that kind of talent. And then frankly, you start making that business case because, to the point earlier, you get people in those companies who don't have the degree to freely and openly say, I am leading P&L that is, you know, a $500 million piece of business for Verizon, and I don't have a college degree. And so you start sort of creating that narrative to show their success rate. And you can do a comparison to that person versus someone who had the degree who couldn't move that revenue needle forward. So there's a lot of different ways that you have to get very practical and tactical to make that business case. And some of it is understanding what your company is valuing when you put that business case together. So I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to, if there are more questions, we can send out answers later. I'm always very respectful of people's time and want to make sure that we deliver on our commitment of ending this within 45 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Rose. Listen, you don't have a business if you don't have employees. You can't run your business, and your business exists because you have the people that help you. Let's all make a commitment to figuring out what next steps work for those on the call, for the companies that you advise, for the companies that you work at, for the companies you're collaborating with, whatever it is. I will take some questions back to Rose and Byron. We will get some answers to you, being respectful of when they have time to answer, but we will get some thoughts back to you. My hope is that Byron and Rose say yes to some sort of a master class to give you the tools to see tangible outcomes. I want to leave with this. One of my favorite people that's on the line, we didn't get to cover her question, is Nancy Duyan. And Nancy is a human factors engineer. She's a woman who has an incredible story from being homeless to being helpless to being a complete change agent and visionary. So we know people that will get this work done. And I just want you, Rose, and you, Byron, to know that the ecosystem of culture shifters are here to help you move the needle. Thank you, Verizon, for sponsoring this. Thank you for the work that you do. And Byron, thank you for, creating a space to be an agent of change. And I think you and Rose together, I don't know what you're going to do after this, but I am not going to get in the middle of that because it's going to be magic and powerful. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will be in touch.